Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar where we will be looking at the evolving health technology assessment or HTA landscape for medical devices and diagnostics across the Asia Pacific region. So for those of you I don't know, my name is Georgia Swan and I manage the Government Affairs and Market Access function at APACMed based here in Singapore. So today we're going to be sharing insights from our recently published white paper, The Evolving Health Technology Assessment Landscape for Medical Devices and Diagnostics in the Asia Pacific region and Key Considerations for Value Assessment Framework. So this paper was developed by IQVIA MedTech in partnership with APACMed and our Market Access Working Group, and its contents really contribute to the growing evidence base in the area of HTA for medical devices and diagnostics in the region. I'd like to extend a huge thank you to IQVIA and also to APACMed's member contributors for their work on this important paper. And if you haven't already accessed a copy, you can do so via the resource link in your audience console in this panel, or access it on either APACMed or IQVIA's website. So before we begin, just quickly a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console, you'll see multiple application widgets, which you can use throughout the session. The first is for Q&A, so we encourage you to ask questions throughout the session. To do so, you can click on the Q&A widget at the bottom of the screen and submit your question, and these will be discussed with our speakers at the end of the webinar. Please indicate when you submit your question who the question is directed at. A copy of today's slide pack that we'll run through is available in the resource list, and this is the widget that looks like a little green folder at the bottom of your screen. And if you have any technical difficulties with the platform throughout, please click on the help widget. It's the one with a question mark icon and it covers some common technical issues. Okay, so we'll get started. So today we're going to be hearing from two of the paper's key contributors, Sirinthip Petcharapiruch, who is the Principal of RealWorld Solutions at IQVIA APAC. And Sirin's going to be discussing today key takeouts from the paper, looking at HTA as a value assessment tool and the existing landscape across APAC. And we'll also be discussing key considerations for developing robust value assessment frameworks for medical devices and diagnostics. And our second speaker, Virginia Priest. Virginia is the Head of Health Economics and Market Access at Boston Scientific, APAC, and is also a co-chair of our APACMed Market Access Working Group. Virginia will be speaking today about some of the objectives of the paper and looking at the topic from a payer perspective, and also discussing some key takeaways that will help inform use and understanding of this tool going forward. So I will hand over to Sirin now to get started. Thank you, Sirin.
Thank you, Georgia, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining the webinar today as well. It's my honor to share with you the findings from our white paper on the topic of health technology assessment of MDDs and consideration for value assessment in APAC. And first of all, I also would like to thank to my co-author, Khalid Wong, and also the IQVIA team, Georgia, Virginia, and APACMed Market Access Working Group, who kindly contribute to this paper until it is successfully published today. So my presentation for today will cover from the definition as a refreshment of HTA, then we'll have some summary of the landscape, consideration and framework for MDD, and alternative approach and the way forward. So health technology assessment, or HTA, is a terminology that has been mentioned widely in healthcare space over the past 10 years. Generally speaking, HTA is considered as one value assessment tool that requires multidisciplinary subjects to evaluate health intervention. The International Network Agency for Health Technology Assessment, or INA-HTA, has defined HTA as a systematic evaluation of the effects of health technology, including direct, intended, unintended, as well as indirect consequence. The main purpose of HTA is to inform technology-related policymaking in healthcare, and usually conducted by interdisciplinary groups using analytical frameworks. Most HTA agencies in APAC have established HTA as one set of tools to evaluate technology to ensure budget prioritization and efficiency in resource allocation. HTA environment in APAC is actually considered quite dynamic, with a mix of markets from infancy stage to mature stage. We can broadly archetype them into three groups. This is based on level of establishment of the system and impact to pricing and reimbursement decision in the market. On the right-hand side, we showing the mature stage. Australia, Taiwan, and Korea are considered as mature HTA systems with the well-established HTA agencies, system, and processes. The HTA is formalized and have legislation in place, so the impact to healthcare decision-making is also considered high. While most of the markets in APAC are considered in advancing stage or in the middle, whereby they may or may not have established HTA agencies, system, and processes, and mostly most of the countries are still evolving. Impact to healthcare decision making is also still considered selective. Singapore, China, Malaysia, Japan, and Thailand are considered in advancing stage. And finally, there are markets, many of the emerging markets in APAC regions, like Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, and India, that also that's considered as rising HTA with newly established agency, system, and processes. The impact to healthcare decision making is still considered limited at this stage. In this table is to provide you a high-level summary on the type of evidence required or considered for HTA for MDDs in APAC. Most countries do not have different requirements comparing to drugs in our findings. But it is still also worth to mention that from this table, each country may also have different specific definition of each type of evidence they consider, or even specific detail on the evidence that's considered in that country. So we also recommend to confirm the detail again with the local payer before proceeding for HTA submission. And apart from the evidence, I also would like to highlight some markets like Australia, Taiwan. They also consider some other consideration like patient's voice, which is also incorporated as part of that process. And also Singapore is another country that also consider organizational feasibility of MDD as well. In my presentation today, I also would like to highlight some of the updates on the HTA and market access process for MDD in China. China is considered as one of the most evolving and complex markets, and the Chinese government also has implemented several measurements and policy that impact on market access of MDD in quite recently. Especially for reimbursement and tendering process, they implement tighter expenditure control with national level DRG payment guidelines, which later expand at provincial level. This measurement is, of course, more favor to local industry. And additionally, on tendering process, government just promoted comprehensive value-based procurement for medical consumables products. This volume-based procurement is firstly implemented at municipal level with intensive price cuts, and then later is also implemented at regional, provincial level as well, which also have a cross-regional collaboration. So the impact is become wider. And ultimately, at the hospital access level, the implementation of true invoice policy and preference of local products among public hospitals also impact to overall market access in China. It prolongs listing process and also drive channel consolidation and squeeze overall margin. So as a result, this associated to the delay of new product introduction by at least 2 years on average, also lower overall price of the product and promote more local industry. In our finding of the paper, SMBD is considered very different from medicine, and currently not every system in APAC recognize this difference and implement a separate HTA pathway for MDDs. So we believe that this nuance should be considered for HTA and value assessment for MDD as well. There is some points to be considered. First point is administration. Of course, outcome for medicines is usually dependent to dosage and adherence, whereas MDDs mostly administered during medical procedure, and outcome may also vary depend on skill of the SCP. Therefore, learning curve and experience of SCP should also be taken into consideration. Secondly, on the clinical evidence, large RCT or randomized control trials, which is gold standard for most of medicines, may not always feasible to be conducted for MDDs as well. So HTA should also allow flexibility of study design for evidence consideration. And real-world evidence or different types of methods can also bridge evidence gap from RCT as well. And next, this also linked to the third point here, whereby there is a challenge to identify qualified site and principal investigator for clinical study of MDD. Because as infrastructure and capacity building is required in many settings. And finally, on product life cycle, MDDs may take shorter development cycle when compared to medicine. So that means like rapid incremental change should be also taken into the consideration and process as well. With the fact that HTA landscape in APAC is so dynamic, by nature of MDD itself is also considered complex. So we believe that there is no one-size-fits-all approach, and system should also allow enough flexibility for multiple types of MDD. Therefore, when it comes to applying the principle of MDD, there needs to be a robust framework in place with some consideration that address uniqueness of MDDs, such as clear criteria and methods for assessment, allow opportunity for public input or stakeholder involvement, including incorporate their input into process. This point is also need to be considered as part of the system. And of course, like I mentioned, there should be a consideration of all types of evidence based on the flexibility and based on the feasibility of each context. And also, transparency is one of the most important considerations. Transparency of process and decision making, and this should also they also should recognize the distinction between medicine and MDDs. As HTA may not always be the most appropriate value assessment tool, depend on various factors and specific context of each country. There are some alternative approaches that could be considered for value assessment for MDD. For example, performance-based risk-sharing agreement. In this example, like in that manufacturer will be paid based on actual performance of the technology. Like in this example, if patients want to be readmitted for certain ICD-10 code within 30 days of initial implant of the new drug, eluting stent, the hospital would receive a rebate around 4 times of the cost. Multi-criteria decision-making, or MCDA, is also seen as alternative approach that aim to address limitations in HTA. MCDA allows the inclusion of comprehensive list of value dimensions and also assign quantitative weights across different dimensions. And finally, also horizontal scanning is also another alternative approach that has been implemented in Australia since 2004 as well. So as there is numerous new innovative medical technology available these days, the ultimate goal of HTA is to ensure patient access to high-value treatment. And to ensure the achievement of this goal, especially for APAC, where the environment is still quite dynamic, we believe that public and private collaboration is the way forward. Collaboration among different stakeholders will also allow better understanding of the uniqueness and needs of each health system environment and specific context of MDDs. Values of the product should also be well demonstrated by industry with robust evidence, while there should remain flexibility from the reviewer side on the evidence requirement, and its value should also be recognized beyond just short-term budget or short-term goal. And finally, we believe that strong partnership will also foster sustainable outcome to healthcare system, especially for emerging markets in APAC, whereby there is still a need for capacity building in many countries. All of this will help accelerate access to new medical technologies, enhance effective and sustainable resource utilization in the system, and ensure optimal benefit to patients who is the true beneficiary of health technology. Thanks for your kind attention, and I will also hand over to Virginia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sirin. That's a great introduction to our white paper, and we'll move on to the next section, which is an industry perspective. Good morning, everyone. It's really great to have you join us this morning. So I'm Virginia, and I'm a health economist, and I lead the regional Boston Scientific HEMA team. And what we do is we work really closely with our country teams to develop HTA evidence to support reimbursement. And we also work with our marketing and sales colleagues to develop value creation tools or economic value tools to support patient access to needed therapy. And this slide is to remind you that, to let you know that these are my views, these are not Boston Scientific's views. But it's been a pleasure working with the APAC Mid team and with IQVIA to develop the paper. So in this session today, first of all, we're going to step back and think about our audience, who are the payers and the HTA bodies. What's their perspective? Why do they need HTA, and what does their HTA environment need to look like? And with this in mind,
Moving to 2, how can we achieve our objectives, which is to help shape an HTA system that is fair and recognises the differences between devices and diagnostics compared with medicines. Sirin briefly introduced our principles, step 3, and this paper really draws together all our best practices from around the world, working with HTA bodies, working in medical devices and diagnostics. And what it does is it provides a unified industry voice. So we're all asking for the same thing, and it's very clear when we're having conversations with our payers and policymakers. So we'll talk about how to use that and how APAC Mid plans to take this forward as an industry association. In 2005, I was working for PharmAC, which is New Zealand's reimbursement agency and manages the drug budget and now also supports device purchasing. We were given some new funding and the responsibility for the cancer budget. And with that, we made several quick funding decisions that meant for patients all over New Zealand, they could access the same oncology medicines for their breast, colorectal and brain cancer. The public were really happy to have new treatment options, and we at PharmAC, as an evaluator, being part of the HTA process, we felt really positive that New Zealanders are going to be better off because of these decisions. I guess what I'm getting to here is that rather than seeing HTA bodies and payers as a hurdle that limits patient access, they're actually an enabler. Payers do want patients to get better by providing funded access to new treatments. They want it to be to the right things, treatments that are high value and going to improve quality of life and in a sustainable way that's not going to bankrupt the budget. So let's take a walk in the reimbursement agency's shoes. Since many of us this morning are here in Singapore, let's imagine that we're ACE, the Agency for Care Effectiveness. This is the new Singapore government HTA agency that is in charge of driving better decision making in healthcare. We have 100 million Singapore dollars left to invest in 2020. And this is the way we could spend it. There's 3 hypothetical, I stress hypothetical, new technologies. They all treat different patient groups and conditions. So HeartFix Jr. is a non-invasive surgery for newborns with heart disease. HIP-HIP-Hooray is an add-on drug treatment for osteoporosis. And Herlozumab is a treatment for a rare type of early breast cancer. They all cost $100 million. And they all improve patients' lives differently, as you can see in the outcomes at the bottom of the slide. We know how many patients will benefit, 100 for HeartFix Jr., 5,000 for HIP-HIP-Hooray, and 500 for Herlozumab. But what we don't know is which one is best value for that money. And to help us make our decision, that's what we'd like to find out doing an HTA. I'm going to leave you with this mulling over, this example, and we're going to go back to it towards the end of the presentation. Okay, so we've seen why payers need HTA to help them make good decisions. And from Sirin's presentation, we've seen that all over APAC, countries are at various stages of implementing their own HTA processes. The way that HTA is conducted will be really important for our patients and our physicians, and of course our business, because it will determine what evidence is required to get funded and how long the funding process will take. So this brings me back to the objectives of our white paper and conversation today. Why did we develop it? We wanted to share our collective learnings from working in HTA systems all over the world and be able to highlight some of the differences between medical devices and diagnostics and medicines, because everyone knows HTA was originally set up for medicines It doesn't mean that it can't be applied for medical devices and diagnostics, but it shouldn't be applied in exactly the same way if we want to get good outcomes. We also wanted to unify the voice of the medtech industry across APAC so that we're all asking for the same thing. That makes it easier for policymakers and payers to understand the request and use the information that we have. And we also wanted to establish APAC Mid and all of its members, many who will be on this call, as educated and willing partners to work with HTA agencies and payers in APAC. So to sum it all up, we want to shape a good healthcare system, a good HTA system for everyone, our payers, providers, physicians, and our patients. So what does a good HTA system look like? Our white paper puts forward 15 key principles or best practices for an HTA process that will work for medical devices and diagnostics. And this is based on our experience with MDD HTA around the world. I won't go into all of the principles in detail. You can see many are process related, as Sirin covered, submission guidelines, having clear submission guidelines so that we can present the right information the first time and save everybody work. Having reasonable and predictable timelines, that will really help for good business planning, but it also helps our patients and physicians with the expectations of when a new needed technology is going to be available. And opportunities for people of all sorts, patients, industry, physicians, to consult and to be part of the process. Stakeholders are really important. HTA affects a lot of different groups. They should have defined roles and definitely clinical experts. And most of our the HTA processes around APAC are very good at including the clinical voice. And of course the evidence, as Sirin mentioned, the evidence for devices does often look different, and it looks different for many reasons. So having an appreciation of that and being open-minded about the evidence and making ways to use it. And finally, solutions. Devices do have a very quick turnaround in terms of innovation, so quick reassessment. Sometimes, and this happens with drugs as well, the evidence is not strong enough to suggest a funding based on the current evidence, and there might be a recommendation to develop more evidence while it is being funded. So that's called coverage with evidence development or funding with evidence. That it's also called a managed entry scheme in Australia. That's one way to develop the evidence that we need without delaying the time to market. And importantly, we'll touch on this a little later, HTA is not the only decision criteria that should be taken into account. So how are we going to use this? This white paper gives us an opportunity to engage with payers and policymakers on HTA and get a seat at the table. In APAC, as Sirin talked about, there are many different HTA bodies all over the region, and they are at different stages of development. So this paper means we can talk to people on both sides, in the mature section as well as the rising HTA. We can also bring, from an industry perspective, from APACMed's perspective, health economics is in HTA, the skill set is relatively rare, the supply is increasing, but we can help out with capacity building, and that's something that we intend to look into. And also bringing in thought leaders from around the world, from our experience with working in HTA markets around the world. This, as we've talked about, this is a soft launch given the COVID-19 climate. However, given public debt is only going up at the moment, we the HTA is only going to get more important in the future too. So we really do think that this is going to be a relevant conversation for many years to come. Georgia is going to speak at the end about a couple of the initiatives that we are already getting into with using the HTA paper to work with some of our government policymakers. Okay, so back to our mission impossible, as we used to call it at PharmAC. We did an HTA, we did a cost effectiveness analysis of our options to find out how they compared in terms of health outcomes and value for money. So let's take a minute more to work this through. QALYs are the common currency for health outcomes and health economics. So a QALY, a quality adjusted life year, represents 1 year of life at full health. Our cost per QALY tells us how much money we need to spend to get one QALY. This is the bang we're getting for our buck. Based on cost per QALY on the cost effectiveness ratio, hip hip hooray is the best value. It has more QALYs gained than the others, and therefore it's the most cost effective. But how do we feel about that? This answer is actually to prove that while health economics is important for decision makers, it shouldn't be the only consideration. I've been part of these conversations before, and I bet that ACE would be talking about societal values and preferences for treating old versus the young, as well as a lot of other equity issues. So that brings us back to the principles. HTA should be part of the decision-making process, but not the only criteria. There are other very important considerations, such as clinical need, budget impact, and equity. So some takeaways and leaving notes. HTA is part of the decision-making process. It's not the only criteria. Medical device companies do generate high-quality evidence, and we need to continue to do that, and we will. An HTA process that recognises the challenges and the differences with device and diagnostic evidence will help address access to new technology and improve patient outcomes. There are other elements that we should discuss when we're talking to the policymakers around if a poor HTA process is put in place, then this can really result in reduced patient choice. There's just not technologies available for their particular condition, higher cost, both in evaluation costs and getting medical technologies to market, and it is a disincentive for innovation. And as Sirin finished on too, I'd really like to highlight that collaboration is the way forward. Let's work together. Like many things in life, collaboration can increase the quality of HTA, and working with evidence, if evidence generators are working with evidence assessors, we can get it right. That's the end of my piece, Georgia. I'd like to hand over to you for Q&A, and then we'll talk about how APAC Mid is using the paper.
Thank you very much, Virginia, and thank you, Sirin, for providing us with that really in-depth landscape overview and contextualising this within the APAC region, and I think really importantly shedding light on this from the lens of the payer. So I'll just make a point, Sirin, you provided a case study from the China context. So just to note that we've actually had this paper translated into Mandarin, and we'll be making that available soon. So do look out for that. So thank you. I've seen a number of questions come through. If you haven't already, please click on the Q&A widget to submit your questions. To start with, I've seen a few questions come through around accessing the slides. So as mentioned earlier, if you have a look at the bottom of your screen, there is a little icon that is the resource list, and it looks like a green folder. So please click on that and you'll be able to access the slides. If there's any issues, please reach out to me directly and I can send you a copy. Okay, so I'll read through the questions. I think this is both for Virginia and Siren. The question is, has risk-sharing agreement been used with medical devices and diagnostics, and if so, in which country or countries?
As far as I know, the performance-based risk-sharing agreement also has been implemented in Australia, but there is we couldn't find the exact example to share because most of the information also set in confidential. So of course, like Australia is one of the countries that is already implement risk-sharing agreement, performance-based risk-sharing agreement. Other countries that we are aware of that they already consider, like Korea, for example, but not very fully sure whether it's already impact to the MDD specifically. Maybe Virginia has anything to add?
Yeah, I can build on that a little. Thanks, Siren. So devices are a little bit more, I can speak from a device side, more difficult to develop risk-sharing arrangements for because the payer is not usually the central payer. It's usually bought by the hospital or by, for example, a private health insurance. So there are a few intermediaries, which makes tracking the money and tracking the outcomes a little more difficult. So perhaps some examples of more of a coverage with evidence development, which can be considered a type of RSA. There is, in the UK, we had a brand new technology go through an assessment process where it was funded for a particular number of patients, and then the results were reviewed and a broader funding was made available. And we have a similar scheme happening with the coverage with evidence development piece in Korea, which is mainly focused on structural heart in the device space. So I think it's something that is gaining some traction, but it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach. It's not as easy to do as with medicine.
Thank you very much, Virginia and Siren. So I think this is a really interesting and really important question that's come through. The question is, you showed some HTA systems that include the patient voice. Could you provide more specific details of how this is done?
Let me share like one of the most recent example that implemented in Taiwan. Taiwan is a country that, as part of the new generation of their health law, they also implement patient voice as part of the consideration for HTA process. They slowly start to implement like step by step, starting from inviting open for website to gather public input. So patients or public people can also start like sharing their input into the website. Then the HTA agency, they're going to gather the input and take into consideration as part of the process. Then later on, they also start allowing the representative from patient side. So they allow patients to sit in as part of the committee, but they should not be able to comment or give the comments during the meeting. But of course, they can consolidate the input from other group of public, and they also can consider earlier before the meeting. And the patient representative can be sit in as a for observer at this moment. They also have a goal and plan in place that they gradually they will allow patient representative to give the comments and share their be able to vote in during the consideration of HTA process. This is one of the examples that I can share for the recently implemented in Taiwan.
Great. Thank you very much, Siren.
There's a few ways to do it, just to add, Georgia. There's a few ways to do it too. Public consultation, which is one of our principles, is another way to achieve some of that patient and consumer voice. And there are some agencies around the region, including New Zealand, and I think it's under consideration in Singapore as well, where there is a consumer advisory group that's involved and comments on not always the funding decisions, but as part of the process. So I think it's something that is, again, we're going to see a trend towards more patient engagement.
Great, thank you both. So the next question, what is the acceptance for real-world evidence in HTA for medical devices and diagnostics? Which real-world evidence types are seen to be acceptable in HTA?
Take a shot at that, Sarah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So currently in the system itself, most of the agencies they still leave it quite flexible in terms of whether they consider real-world evidence as part of their as part of HTA submission or not. Like, for example, in Singapore guideline, they also just mention depend on the circumstance. That is one of the example. So the type of, I don't think that is specific requirement per se to say that this is a specific type that they can accept. So the acceptability will definitely based on the case-by-case basis and whether the design and approach is considered scientifically sound. That may be the way that they can review and consider. Virginia, do you have anything else to add?
I agree with what you said, Sarah. And yeah, I think it really, the main gist of it is that does it answer the questions or the uncertainty that remains from the clinical trials? So it's very situation dependent, and that could be. It could be a registry in some cases. It could be a small RCT. I think it just depends on what uncertainty there still is around the clinical comparative clinical effect and how to address that. So good.
Thank you.
Good to have some flexibility.
And another question has come through. Is there evidence that rising and advancing countries are learning from matured countries in the region in terms of their challenges, practices, etc.?
So absolutely. So I would say probably one of the clear evidence that I can observe may not directly from the country that we consider as a mature, but in the organization itself is considered quite mature, which is Thailand, HITAP. HITAP also get support from NICE, for example, and then they also receive some funding. So they become because they already implement their, establish their organizations quite since 2007. So they already build capacity along the way, and then just over the past 5 years, I believe, they start providing support and training to many of the Southeast Asian countries, including other countries in South Asia like India, Bhutan, for example. So if you may also see from somewhere from their website as well. They keep sending their researchers to provide training. And then to other emerging country HTA system in rising HTA archetype. Then they also sharing the knowledge. For example, some of the economic evidence, economic evaluation models that's also shared across. That is also one of the knowledge and case lesson learned from what they try to support to across different countries. And for my personal view, I think one of the countries that is considered in mature stage, and also one of the good lessons learned for other countries, in my opinion, is also Taiwan. I think Taiwan is like slowly implement the process step by step and allow the time for to build the capacity in the country, and also provide capacity training in the country as well, which is going quite nicely. That slowly they start building their resource, and then they start encouraging the requirement, how to implement the requirement or measurement that allow and encourage the capacity building in the country.
Thank you, Sirin. And just to sort of flag that, we know like there are a lot of different organisations. Our payers are talking to each other, which is a good thing. So there's like the HTA Policy Forum, HTA Asia Link, ISPOR. So there is a network for sharing best practices. I guess what is a little different about our opportunity here is that we are representing companies from all over the world and have experience in Europe and the US as well. And there are some good best practices to share back with Asia there too. So hopefully that is an interesting factor for them in having the conversations with us.
Thank you, Virginia and Sirin. And this question may be particularly relevant for, I think, our startup community. The question is, which systems countries in APAC are most suitable for early stage medical device startups to engage with first, particularly digital health startups?
That's a tricky one. It's slightly out of our area of expertise. That might be a good one for the APAC Mid startup group to think about. There is the Founders Series. I think that will be addressed really well there, rather than me taking a stab at it, unless you know, Sirin.
Yeah, I also agree. This is like probably asking for my opinion. I think like country like Taiwan or Singapore is also some of the country that start implementing HTA already in place, and they already released some guidelines. Especially like Singapore, for example, they have the guideline in place, and at the same time, I also observed that the government also implement some policy to allow encouraging technology development in the country as well. That's probably one of the countries that we can start for the startup can start off. And of course, Taiwan is like the system that they still allow some flexibility, and in terms of the like evidence requirement and things like that. That may be another country, in my opinion.
Thank you. And if Virginia raises a good point, at APACMed we have our Founders Series that's designed to provide mentorship and information such as this. So please do feel free to reach out. It's a good forum to raise questions like this. So another question has just come through. When cost of care could highly depend on the hospital's way of delivering care and or state funding, how should we look at developing an HTA model at a national level, e.g. in Australia, or rather look at developing HTA models per hospitals that we're working with or per state?
I can take a shot at that one if you like. So I would ask who is the decision maker? Who is going to make the decision around whether a technology is used? And if that's at the national level, then that's when you would do a national model, and you would or an HTA, and submit to get broad access across the country. And that's usually, that opens up access, and then you may still need to do a hospital model to be able to show the value of your technology to that specific hospital. But I guess the question is there a national, do you need a national funding recommendation before you can go to the hospitals. If not, then just focus on the hospital decision makers. Is that clear?
Just to add on to Virginia's point as well, I fully agree with that. I actually think that there is no single answer. It also depends on the context of different countries. Some countries, the decision making will be mainly on the national level, but some countries where the national reimbursement or HTA may not be well established, and they still allow some decentralized decision at the hospital level. That, of course, the hospital decision making would be the key priority.
Great, thank you both. And I think this next question that's just come through, we've touched on this in the presentations and in previous questions, but what would the ideal requirements be for an HTA so that the result can be used for reimbursement for medical devices?
Okay, I can. Do you want to take that one, Sirin, or shall I?
Okay, let me kick start. So I don't think there is any ideal requirement in my opinion. But of course, as part of the, I presented earlier, there should be consideration in place, and definitely the consideration should be specific to the nuance of the different in the NDV context, and also, of course, in the context of the country. So there shouldn't be a single answer to answer that. And I believe that flexibility and everything based on transparency and the scientifically judgment, I think that it should be the best way to proceed. Virginia, do you have anything to add on?
Yeah, I think only that use your evidence as best you can. Assumptions introduce uncertainty, so wherever possible, really validate those. So, but it just comes back to what evidence do you have and what question are you trying to answer, and making the best of that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Just looking at the time, I think we probably have time for one more question before closing remarks. I can see there are about 8 or 9 unanswered questions, so we will ensure that we take note of these ones that we haven't been able to get to in this session, and follow up with those who've asked the question. So a question that's just come through. The ISA is traditionally defined for the HTA evaluation endpoint. However, given devices are diverse, are there more comprehensive, suitable value considerations recommended for device HTAs?
I think this comes down to being open-minded about the evidence and about that includes about the HTA result. The ISA is the traditional way. It's nice because it allows you to compare technologies, whether they treat a hip fracture or whether they treat heart disease. But it's definitely not the only one. And from my experience working in and with many payers around the region, they do tend to have to understand, straightforward cost analysis, cost consequences, even cost effectiveness, where it's in more of a cost per fracture averted type analysis. So I think it's something that going back to the principles, we should be asking for. Obviously, we understand that the preference may be ISA so that it can be comparable across different treatments, but the understanding that it may not always be available, or it might be more uncertain than another analysis.
Yeah, I fully agree with Virginia's point. ISA itself is probably one of the traditional way that most of the countries start implementing as part of the HTA process. But of course, ISA alone or economic evaluation consideration alone may not be enough, and then they should consider flexibility. They should allow flexibility to consider with different type of evidence to support and justify the value of the new technology as well.
Great, thank you both. And thank you everyone for all your questions. As mentioned, I can see about 8 or 9 unanswered, so we'll have the team at IQVIA email us those questions and ensure we get back to you with a response. I can see also a few people have written in again about accessing the slides. We will send you a copy after this just to make things easier so that you have that on hand. So I'd just like to finish with a few closing remarks. Again, a huge thank you to Sirin and Virginia for sharing their insights and expertise with us today, and to all of you for participating in the session. In terms of this resource from an APAC Med perspective, it's really been an important resource to support knowledge and evidence building around this topic for APAC Med and our members. And as Virginia alluded to, we are and will be continuing to use this tool to engage stakeholders in some key markets across this region in our work to shape fair and transparent and inclusive HTA systems in countries who are looking to implement this. And importantly, as part of one of our overarching objectives of instilling value-based methodologies for broader decision-making for medical devices and diagnostics across APAC. And there are a couple of particular markets, Indonesia and China, that we are working on activities at the moment. So we look forward to sharing more details around that once available. So just lastly, an on-demand version of this webcast will be made available. So if you'd like to listen to it again or share it with any of your colleagues, you can access it via the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. So thank you again, everyone, for participating, and to Sirin and Virginia, and we hope you have a good morning.